Hello, and welcome to HHH, the podcast where we talk about those horrible humans in history. I am your host, Angela Pearson, and if this is your first time joining us, welcome. I am so excited to have you with us, and I hope you enjoy the episode, and make sure you check out all the other episodes. And if you've been with us for a while, welcome back. And again, I hope you enjoyed today's episode. We've got a pretty good one today. But before we jump into that, make sure you're liking and subscribing to the channel and turn on your notifications so you know when we post a new episode. And also make sure you're sharing with all your family and friends, because nothing says I love you more than sharing scary stories from history, right? So make sure you're doing that. But one more thing before we jump into it. I was about to jump into the story, but I need to remind you, if you want to hear about any horrible human in history, please send me a suggestion. I am so happy to talk about who you guys want to talk about. So send me a suggestion. You can comment on this episode, or you can message me on Instagram or Facebook on my Horrible Humans in History pages. So just make sure you send me those. Now we can actually jump into the story. So today, we are heading to Victorian England to unravel the chilling life and crimes of William Palmer. Picture Victorian England at its most respectable, crisp morning coats, quiet country lanes, and gentlemen who swear by honor, reputation, and science. Now imagine that behind one of those polished faces is a man calmly dissolving poison into brandy, soup, or medicine, and killing not out of passion, but out of convenience. Today's story is about a doctor, a husband, and a gambler. Gambler? What's a gambler? Gambler, sorry. And one of the most notorious poisoners in British history. This is the story of William Palmer, a man so infamous that the press actually crowned him the, quote, Prince of Poisoners. Let's get into it. On August 6th, 1824, William Palmer was born in Rugeley in Staffordshire County in England, into a family that embodied respectability and quiet prosperity, which made his later crimes all the more shocking. So his father was Joseph Palmer. He was a successful timber merchant and a sawmill owner in Rugeley. He was known locally as a hardworking, disciplined man who valued appearances, financial stability, and social standing. Joseph Palmer accumulated enough wealth to provide his children with an education, professional opportunities, and a comfortable upbringing, something that many families in Victorian England definitely could not afford. Palmer's mother, so William Palmer's mother, Elizabeth Palmer, came from a similarly respectable background, while far less documented in historical records, which pretty common for the ladies. She was described as an attentive and conventional mother, focused on maintaining the household and reinforcing the social expectations of the middle-class family. So she really emphasized manners, propriety, and reputation, values which William would later exploit rather than honor. So together, his father and mother created a home environment that prized outward morality and social credibility. But there's very little evidence that there was a lot of strong emotional bonds or moral guidance beyond just the outward appearance of morality. So this environment may have helped foster William's lifelong fixation on status without a corresponding sense of ethical responsibility, because he really cared what people thought about him. He wanted to be high standing in society, but he really didn't care about ethics too much, as you will find out. So William was actually one of several children, and he grew up alongside a lot of brothers and sisters in a household that was, like I said, materially comfortable, but pretty emotionally distant. The most significant sibling in William's life, or should I say story, not necessarily his life, but in his story, is his brother Walter Palmer. Walter was considered responsible, steady, and far less reckless than William. And unlike his brother, Walter did not gamble, which we will get into in a second, excessively, and was seen as very trustworthy. Traits that made him super useful to William later on in life. And William did not admire his brother for these traits. And we're going to get more into detail about Walter and William's relationship a little bit later. But growing up in Rugeley, William enjoyed a level of privilege that insulated him from consequences. His father's success meant William was spared physical labor and instead prepared for a professional career. This made him very entitled, and he had a belief that comfort was his natural state and that inconvenience was something to be avoided at all cost. It sounds familiar with a lot of people nowadays, if you ask me. As a teenager, William was described as very clever and confident and very persuasive, but also unreliable. Shocker. He borrowed money casually and showed very little urgency in repaying debts. I don't know if any of you have ever had friends like that. I don't think I have. Maybe one or two, but those people are the worst and you never want to give them money. So he was one of those people. When confronted, he relied on charm rather than accountability to escape paying what was owed. So this pattern really created problems of him talking his way out of basically anything, and it would follow him for most of his life. And at some point, it would stop working, which you will see. So in his late teens, William was apprenticed to a local medical practitioner. So in this apprenticeship in Victorian England, it was very, very hands-on. And he was able to learn how to mix medications, administer treatments, and observe the effects of powerful substances on the human body, up close and personal. This was really important in his timeline because this is when he actually started showing a very particular interest in pharmacology. So if you don't know what that is, it's preparing medicines. It's how medications affect the human body and those kinds of things. But he was not just focused on medicine and healing. He was way more interested in what could actually harm a person, like how specific chemicals acted quickly, violently, and unpredictably in the human body. Equally as important, he learned how little oversight existed in the medical field at the time. Doctors were trusted implicitly. No questions asked. Everyone trusted a doctor. Patients did not question prescriptions. Poisons were legal, accessible, and very poorly tracked, so that made it really easy for him to access the things he needed. And for William, learning all of this was not just an education, it was instruction on what he would later do to his victims. So William later continued his studies in London, where his worst tendencies flourished. And by worst tendencies, gambling. He was a huge gambler. Away from family scrutiny, he embraced the city gambling culture, and he really, really liked horse racing. So instead of retreating, William chased losses aggressively. He just knew that at some point he was going to hit it big and settle all of his debts, or at least take the money and run. That was his plan. He really thought he was going to make it big. So he borrowed money under false pretenses, forged documents, and manipulated friends to get all the money he needed to gamble. And his confidence never cracked. It didn't matter how much he lost. He just knew deep down in his heart of hearts he was going to win, even as all his finances catastrophically collapsed. This period marked a psychological turning point for him. William Palmer, sorry, I have used that interchangeably in this script. So William began to normalize deception as a survival tool in all areas of his life. So he got so good at deceiving people, it just became another tool in his belt. Now, in 1846, William obtained his MRCS, which stands for Member of the Royal College of Surgeons of England. So this meant that he became a surgeon. It was a position that was slightly lower than a doctor, which is interesting because now I feel like surgeons are above doctors. Not above them, but like they probably get paid way more because they have to do a lot more schooling. At least I think. I don't know. This is just me making stuff up. But at the time, a surgeon was a position lower than a doctor because mostly what they did was cut off infected limbs. So that is where he was. And the MRCS qualification was a major professional milestone because it officially allowed William to practice surgery, to use the respected MR instead of the DR, like doctor. They used MR titles, build professional credibility, and gain public trust, which was a big thing. That trust was really important. He would later qualify as a licensed, man, guys, I'm struggling today. I'm really tired, so I'm sorry. I'm pronouncing things really terribly today. Licensated, we're just going to skip this. It's an LSA. So he's Licensed Society of Apothecaries, basically is what it is. He was able to prescribe and dispense medications. So this gave him both surgical authority and pharmaceutical authority and access to anything, basically. And by 1846, Palmer was only 22 years old, already medically certified, and all this happened as he entered a phase of life where his gambling addiction and financial collapse just took off. It accelerated like crazy. Probably because now he was earning money in his profession. So this timing is really important because it shows that Palmer's professional legitimacy came before his criminal escalation. So he had to become a professional before he could escalate any of his criminal activity. So he didn't become dangerous until he had the perfect tools, which was an education, access, and trust. Those were his deadly tools. And by his early 20s, like I said, 22 is when he was already licensed. In the 1840s, William was fully qualified as both a physician and a surgeon. And outwardly, he was everything Victorian society admired. He was educated, he was professional, and he was respectable. But behind the facade of the proper English gentleman, he was reckless, dishonest, and deeply in debt. The dangerous combination was now complete. He now had all the medical authority, he had access to all the poisons, mounting financial desperation, and a proven lack of empathy. We have a full recipe for a killer. Now, long before his first confirmed murder, William had already decided, consciously or not, that other people existed to solve his problems. After receiving his MRCS, William decided to move back home to Rugeley while he was still completing the path towards his full medical practice. So just before he got his second license, he moved back to Rugeley. And he, like I said, obtained his apothecary license really soon after he moved home. And at this point, he was already deep into the gambling addiction, and he carried a lot of debts home to Rugeley from London. And this move back home is significant because it marks the moment that William transitioned from just being that reckless medical student to an actual practicing provincial doctor with access to patients, poisons, and social trust. So now everyone saw him as a doctor. Once home, he opened his own medical practice and reconnected with family and local elites. He quickly embedded himself into all the nicest social circles. Shockingly, he still continued horse racing. I know that probably came as a shocker to you. And he kept losing every time he gambled on these horse races. And most importantly, he began mixing his own medications at this point in time and distributing them. So by full adulthood, William's relationship with his parents had actually become pretty strained. His father repeatedly attempted to manage William's debts. So he's trying to protect him and shield him from all the scandal that would have come from all of his debts and preserve the family name because, that was very important. You got to have that respect of the family. And William, behind the scenes, was destroying it. And so his father was trying to cover that up. But rather than reforming his behavior and being grateful for what his father was doing, William treated his parents' support as an entitlement. Like, he just assumed he deserved it. Like, they should be doing this for me because it's not my problem, it's theirs. So with this entitlement feeling, when his father died in 1853 of apoplexy, which you don't know what that is, I looked it up because I didn't either. It's a sudden bleeding or loss of blood flow into an organ, most commonly referring to a severe stroke or pituitary apoplexy. Symptoms are usually severe headaches, vision loss, paralysis, and confusion, often mimicking a stroke. So his father dies of this, which later, if you listen to the symptoms, sounds really familiar. Anyways, that's just my personal opinion. But when his father passed away, he left 70,000 pounds, which in today's money is 6.5 million pounds or $8.7 million. He left that money to the oldest child. Now, William was not the oldest child. William, being entitled, expected to receive a lot of financial relief, but most of the estate was already tied up or insufficient to cover his massive gambling losses. His older brother actually gave each sibling about 7,000 pounds, so he distributed it evenly, and then the remaining 25,000 pounds that was left, he gave to his mother so she could live comfortably. And this really disappointed William, and it appears to have intensified his willingness to view family members as assets rather than loved ones. So instead of his father's death making him feel bad, he became more hardened because he didn't care about his family. By 1854, William was already deeply in debt and under pressure from multiple people demanding repayment. In August 1854, he had an interaction with a fellow co-worker. Is that what you could call him? Fellow intern. It was an associate of his that he had some bad feelings about, and he also owed money to. So his name was Smirk. His last name was Smirk. Smark? I don't know how to say it. You guys know me. That's a good effort. Anyways, in August of 1854, Smirk suddenly became violently ill after spending some time drinking with William, and it was William's alcohol that had been provided. Now, witness reported that his symptoms were severe vomiting, collapse, spasms, and extreme physical distress. Now, these are very similar symptoms to his future victims, but Smirk did not die. But the episode was serious enough to alarm people around him to just kind of avoid William. And his survival is super critical because it shows that William was starting to actually experiment with these poisons and failing before he was able to escalate to fatal doses. So this really suggests that William was already actively poisoning people months before the famous murder where he was actually convicted. So there's also another story about William's interaction with Smirk, where he actually doused all of Smirk's clothing in acid, but I couldn't find any. I just heard this on one of the videos that I watched about him, and I couldn't really find any other documentation or historical records to back up that story, so do with that what you will. Now, William was never brought as a witness or charged in Smirk's poisoning because in Victorian toxicology, it was very limited at the time. They didn't have a lot of ways to really test for that kind of stuff on living people. And since Smirk lived and no chemical proof existed, authorities really couldn't pursue any charges. But during William's later investigation, Smirk's case was re-examined and used to show that William established a pattern of suspicious poison-related behaviors way before he was actually convicted. So crossing the line between just poisoning someone and actually killing someone was no longer a question of if, but when he would succeed. So at this point, William was hemorrhaging money. He was just losing it before he could earn it, basically. He would forge bills, borrow under false pretenses, and took out life insurance policies on relatives, which we will talk about in a second. And doesn't that sound familiar? If you've listened to H.H. Holmes yet, sounds very familiar. If not, go listen to that episode when you're done with this episode. Wait till you're done with this episode. Now, instead of seeing people as loved ones, he really did begin to see them as financial opportunities. So, with that being said, on October 7th, 1847, William married Anne Thornton, or Annie Brooks. She went by either one. She came from a wealthy family. Well, they were wealthy. Let me explain why they were wealthy. So they were wealthy because her mother had actually slept with a colonel and became pregnant with Annie. In his will, he actually put that Mary Thornton, so Annie's mother, and his daughter, Annie, should receive all of his inheritance, including any and all property that he owned. So when he passed away, Mary Thornton became very wealthy. So her daughter would be a prime target for William because she had a lot of inheritance that she had gotten. Now, after Annie and William had gotten married, it will come as no surprise that he did not get along with his mother-in-law, Mary Thornton. She did not like that, or did not like him, because he had borrowed a lot of money from her and seemed to have no intention of paying the debt back. The Christmas after Annie and William were married, William convinced Mary to move in with them. And she decided, yeah, why not? I'll move in with my daughter and her now husband. And so she moved in with them at Christmas, and she was dead in January. Yep, did not take that long. A lot of people were not super suspicious of her death because she tended to drink a lot of alcohol, so people just assumed that's what did it. But William had counted on his wife inheriting everything from his mother-in-law, including numerous properties. And I love this part of the story because it's really funny. So William had spent a lot of his own money renovating the real estate that Mary Thornton had owned, because he really believed that when she died, it would be his, because he was married to his or her daughter. Well, this is a little bit of karma for him, because the colonel's will actually was contested by his closest living male relative. Because remember, this is the 1800s, so women had no rights on inheritance or anything else. If we're honest, they had no rights at this point. So when this male relative contested the will, he won. The court sided with him, meaning that all of the colonel's wealth was stripped away, including all of these properties, and William had spent time and money improving someone else's property to make it more valuable for them. Wah, wah, wah. A little bit of karma for him. Not good enough karma, but a little bit of karma. So soon after, though, after this happened, Annie fell ill. Frequently and mysteriously, she suffered violent vomiting, seizures, and weakness, and William, of course, treated her himself. In September of 1854, Annie got violently ill. Her dedicated, quote-unquote, husband stayed by her side the whole time, treating her himself. Her symptoms seemed to persist with the vomiting and seizures, and also she was weak to the point of collapsing. And this happened so quickly, she deteriorated so fast, and she soon died. And at the time of her death, it was officially recorded as natural causes, but later investigators and historians widely suspected poisoning. I wonder why. I suspect poisoning, especially because William had taken out multiple life insurance policies on her, totaling £13,000. For some perspective, in today's money, that would be £2.27 million, or $2.9 million in today's money. And for that life insurance policy, he was supposed to make a payment of £760 a month for this insurance policy, and he had only made one payment before she died. That's how soon before she passed away, he got these life insurance policies. So that's not suspicious in any way, shape, or form. And again, her symptoms matched later poisoning cases, and he really benefited financially upon her death. But there was never an autopsy performed on her. And even at the time, other doctors came to examine her after her death and attributed her death to natural causes. And they guessed most likely it was cholera. But rumors did start to spread, and people were suspicious of William since he had insured her life pretty heavily. and her symptoms matched poisoning. So people were suspicious, but no one really said anything. And to add to that, William and Annie had several children, but most of them died in infancy or early childhood, which was not uncommon for Victorian England. However, the pattern around William raised a lot of suspicion, especially once he was discovered that he had, in fact, poisoned people. People got pretty suspicious that those deaths were not an accident. And between 1849 and 1854, William lost at least 3 children to infancy. And I don't have the exact birth and death dates because they weren't fully preserved in public records. But, like I said, multiple infants died within months of their birth. And at least 2 died while William was practicing medicine and living at home, not to mention that William personally treated these children during their illnesses, and he would have seen them as a financial burden because he's a psychopath. And although infant mortality was pretty high at the time, investigators later flagged William's family history because his wife died suspiciously. His brother, which we're going to talk about in a second, died suspiciously. He had huge gambling debts and had easy access to the poisons, and he had insurance policies on some of these people. So he was never charged for the children's deaths either, just like he wasn't charged for his wife's death. But they're still considered suspected but unproven victims. So, with his wife gone, there was literally only one other person he could try to get a big payday out of. And that was his brother, Walter. Remember, I mentioned Walter. Walter Palmer was William's younger brother. So it wasn't even his oldest brother, it was his younger brother. And ironically, one of the few people who consistently tried to help William. It was his one loyal brother, and it hurts my heart to hear that because it was the only sibling that truly cared about William at this point. Walter was responsible, financially stable, trustworthy, and much less reckless than William. And by 1854 to 1855, Walter had become one of William's primary financial supports. So he lent him lots of money and was trying really hard to help him manage his debts. But Walter had started to question William's honesty and push back against the continuous loans. So Walter was starting to hit his breaking point, and William was not a fan. So his brother was wearing out his helpfulness. So William tried to take out, this is crazy. William tried to take out an £84,000 loan, which in today's money would be 12 to 13 million, or depending on how you adjust for inflation and that kind of stuff. I don't really know how to do that, but this is what Google said about the difference. So it could be 12 to 13 million, or if you adjusted certain ways with inflation, it could be up to $200 million in today's money. He tried to take out a life insurance that high on his brother. Even 12 to 13 million seems absolutely ridiculous. 200 million, geez Louise. But because his brother wasn't royalty or anyone super important in the country, no one was willing to give him such a hefty policy. And you would think that should have been a giant red flag for people and been like, this is really suspicious. This guy has had multiple people die around him that had life insurance policies. Now he's wanting to take out this massive life insurance policy on his brother. maybe we should check into this. No one did anything. Nope. So he was able to get a £13,000 life insurance policy out on his brother, which was the same amount that he received for his wife. And he also made sure that the insurance policy was to him, it would be accredited to him, not to Walter's wife. So he planned this out. And in early February 1855, Walter suddenly became violently ill after taking some medicine prescribed by William. Shocker. The symptoms were immediate and horrifying. Severe vomiting, violent convulsions, muscle spasms, extreme physical pain, and rapid physical collapse. He was conscious for all of it. Do these symptoms sound familiar? They should, because witnesses later described Walter thrashing in bed and struggling to breathe. That sounds like a horrible way to die, if you ask me. William remained at his bedside and personally controlled the medication. I mean, obviously he did. He had to make sure that his brother didn't survive this ordeal. And multiple people later found that William's behavior was pretty suspicious as his brother was dying because he discouraged any outside doctors from interfering. He wanted no other doctors in the room. He insisted on preparing Walter's medication himself. He wouldn't let anyone else help. He remained calm and emotionally detached, even though this was the only brother who actually cared about him. And he seemed focused on paperwork and financial matters instead of making sure his brother was healed. And instead of panicking, he was under complete control. Now, Walter died officially in February of 1855, just days after falling ill. Almost immediately, William began dealing with Walter's financial affairs. He called in the insurance and debts were addressed, and money began to flow straight towards William. And family members were devastated, but they never publicly accused William. Now, in Victorian England, social pressure was really strong and discouraged scandal within respectable families. It's crazy how rigid they were at protecting that, especially when the accused was a doctor. So it is possible that they may have suspected that William had something to do with it, but they were not going to say a thing. And all of his symptoms, Walter's symptoms, matched strychnine poisoning. It was a fast onset, severe convulsions, consciousness maintained during spasms. Oh, that just sounds so awful. And death by respiratory failure. That matched strychnine poisoning to the T. And these symptoms were nearly identical to those later seen in William's final victim, John Parsons Cook. Now, Walter's death shows that William officially crossed into family murder territory and proved that William was willing to kill people who trusted him most. His brother cared about him and he killed him off. It established that William's escalating confidence and boldness, and by this point, William was no longer experimenting. He was refining, and Walter died in agony. Once again, William benefited financially, and no charges were ever filed against him in Walter's death, and it still remained officially, quote, unexplained. That's where they left it at. Now, all of his other siblings faded quietly into the background of history, but their reactions by distancing themselves from William after the suspicious death happened suggests that even his closest family members recognized the danger that he posed. Now, in November of 1855, William's downfall began with running into and meeting his new friend, John Parsons Cook. Cook was a wealthy businessman from Shropshire, got it, Shropshire, and an enthusiastic gambler. So Cook was very well off. He was socially connected, he was trusting, and he was known to carry large sums of money when attending races. And William befriended Cook through his horse racing circles. And you'll never guess, but by late 1855, William owed Cook money. Shocker. Shocking. And was under intense financial pressure to pay him back. On November 14th, while at the racetrack, Cook won a significant amount of money. Money that William desperately needed. And this made Cook the perfect target. William was with him and immediately began to pressure Cook for loans and access to his winnings. So they were at the track together, and William immediately was like, how do I benefit from this? I need his money. So that evening, Cook, surprisingly, I know, you would have never guessed, became violently ill after drinking brandy and water provided by, who do you think? William. Shortly after drinking, Cook experienced, what do you think? Violent vomiting, severe abdominal pain, muscle spasms, sudden collapse. And witnesses, because he at this point, William was just so brazen, he was doing this in a public setting. Witnesses later recalled that William was hovering nearby and closely watching Cook's reaction. Cook partially recovered overnight, but William did not stop. Over the next several days, Cook remained weak. William visited frequently and insisted on administering medicine. Can you guess what the medicine was? On November 21st, 1855, Cook was given additional treatment by William, and shortly afterward, Cook collapsed again, and this time far more violently. He had the intense convulsions, body arching backwards, clenched jaw and limbs, extreme respiratory distress, and there were a lot of witnesses to this one, and they described the scene as horrifying. Witnesses described horrifying symptoms with the vomiting, convulsions, and intense pain. And Cook briefly, like I said, briefly recovered, but then worsened after William administered more medicine. And he eventually died on November 21st, 1855, just a little later that day. Now, William's actions immediately raised red flags. He attempted to interfere with the postpartum process. He tried to retrieve Cook's betting winnings, so he tried to claim his winnings. He pressured people to bury the body quickly, and he showed very little genuine grief. He was focused on logistics and money and not the loss of a friend. Doctors suspected strychnine poisoning right away. While chemical detection was very difficult in 1855, Cook's symptoms matched perfectly, and there was a lot of motive behind why that might have happened. All of his money. So unlike Palmer's earlier suspected victims, Cook was very wealthy. Witnesses actually observed William's involvement. The death occurred publicly, and this time people paid attention to what was happening. Cook's stepfather demanded answers. Rumors exploded. Newspapers seized the story, and media attention exploded. A doctor, a gambler, a friend who always seemed to profit from death is what they saw, because they were seeing the pattern. And authorities ordered an investigation. They were basically forced to act because of all the intense pressure. Now, immediately after Cook's death on November 21st, 1855, William pressured doctors to sign a, quote, natural death certificate as quickly as possible. So just to be like, oh yeah, it was natural causes, hurry, go ahead and sign this. He attempted to have Cook buried very fast because he argued there was no need for further examination. He knew that Victorian embalming and burial would really help to destroy the toxicology results. and any chance of forensic evidence. And him urging this stuff immediately raised suspicion, obviously. But he thought he was just a smooth criminal and could get away with whatever. He was also seen attempting to burn or dispose of a small bottle believed to contain the strychnine residue. And witnesses said that Palmer threw the bottle into the fire, became visibly nervous when questioned, and gave inconsistent explanations as to why he was throwing the bottle into the fire. And this behavior was actually used later to show consciousness of guilt in his trial. So William was also observed taking away bottles and cups from Cook's room, rearranging items after Cook's death, and he attempted to clean the area. Yeah, he is not the brightest light bulb out there, but he thought he was slick. I tell you what. These actions destroyed potential trace evidence before investigators arrived, and he also tried to convince hotel staff and race acquaintances to minimize what they saw. Like, it wasn't as bad as you guys remember, right? Like, it wasn't that bad. He downplayed his presence at the key moments, like trying to get people to be like, oh yeah, I guess you weren't that involved, and reframe Cook's symptoms as a natural illness. And there was a lot of witnesses to this one. And they testified that they were pressured by William to stick to a specific version of events. And that was just so suspicious that they actually exhumed Cook's body. And William objected to extended toxicology tests. He complained about delays. He questioned the competency of the people examining the body. He actually tried to insert himself into the medical process, including bumping into someone who had the contents of the stomach and spilling it, and then trying to claim that it was now contaminated and they couldn't use it. And all of this backfired so badly for him for obvious reasons. The more he interfered, the more suspicious authorities became of him. Now, the prosecution framed William as a man who knew exactly how poisoning investigations work and tried to stay one step ahead of it. His actions showed knowledge of toxicology, fear of discovery, and intent to obstruct justice. And the jury found this behavior just impossible to ignore. So, despite really weak physical evidence, the circumstantial case against William was overwhelming. He was arrested in 1855 and charged with murder. The trial was moved to London due to intense public interest and fear of a biased jury. And then his trial actually became a national obsession, so it makes sense that they would move it to London. Newspapers published daily transcripts. Crowds gathered outside the courthouse. The prosecution argued that William used strychnine to murder Cook for money, but the defense focused on the lack of chemical proof. So one of them had a lot of circumstantial evidence, while the other was basically like, well, you don't have chemical proof that he did anything. But in the end, like I said, the jury sided with common sense over scientific uncertainty. Charles Dickens, the writer of A Christmas Carol, was actually present and an eyewitness to the trial. And he said, let's see if you can understand his English, old-timey way of talking. He said, "The poisoner had a confident expectation of acquittal. We doubt as little that he really had some considerable hope of it, as we do that he made a pretense of having more than he really had. He had poisoned his victims according to his carefully laid plans. He had gotten them buried out of his way. He had murdered and forged, and yet kept his place as a good fellow and a sporting character. He had made a capital friend of the coroner and a serviceable traitor of the postmaster. He was a great public character with a special Act of Parliament for his trial. The choice spirits of the stock exchange were offering long odds in his favor, and to wind up all, there was a tip-top counselor bursting into tears for him, saying to the jury 3 times over, "You dare not, you dare not, you dare not," and bolting clean out of the course to declare his belief that he was innocent. The answer is because it belongs to the extremity that the villain in it should not only declare strong expectation of acquittal himself, but should try to infect all the people about him with it. Besides having an artful fancy not wholly without foundation, he disseminates by that means an impression that he is innocent. To surround himself with his narrowed world with this fiction is, for the time being, to fill a jail with a faintly rose-colored atmosphere and to remove the gallows to a more agreeable distance. Basically, what he's saying is that William tried to paint himself as innocent, and he was convinced he was going to get off and get away with murder, and just didn't even think that there was a possibility he'd be found guilty. Well, he was found guilty of murder. Basically, within an hour after the court adjourned, the jury found him guilty in an hour. Yep. One newspaper said, "Link by link, an irresistible chain of evidence wound around Palmer, and indisputably it was proved that Palmer was the man who poisoned his friend. Never was a foul murder more conclusively brought home to any murderer." He was sentenced to death by hanging at this point. So 1 month after the trial, on June 14th, 1856, William Palmer was executed at Stratford Gaol. I think that's how you say it. The Manchester Guardian said of the hanging, "Palmer looked around, taking in as much of the scene as was possible without turning his head. The bolt was drawn, and with a terrific twang and strain upon the rope, the culprit's body fell 2.5 feet and remained for an instant motionless. Death must have been immediate, for there appeared no room to doubt that the neck was effectually dislocated. The body slowly turned completely around. Then there came a strong convulsive start at the arms and legs. Afterward, a few slight tremors ran through the trunk and the legs, and all was still, save the fresh breeze swayed the body to and fro." Ugh. That was a great description, Manchester Guardian. Well done. And to the very end, he maintained that he was innocent, and he went to the gallows without confession. He definitely was not innocent. He was guilty. Now, William Palmer remains one of the most chilling figures in criminal history, not because he was violent, but because he was trusted. He exposed the terrifying reality that intelligence, education, and respectability can be used as a weapon. His case led to major changes in forensic toxicology and legal standards for poisoning cases, and his name became shorthand for a particular kind of evil, the kind that smiles, prescribes medicine, and waits. So I hope you enjoyed today's story about William Palmer. Next week, we will be talking about a woman named Irma Gries. She was a Nazi concentration camp guard. So as you can imagine, she did some pretty horrendous things. So make sure you tune in next week. Again, make sure you like, subscribe, and share this channel with anyone you think who would enjoy these kinds of stories. Also, send me any recommendations that you might have, and I will be sure to talk about them. But thanks for tuning in, guys, and we'll see you next week on Horrible Humans in History. Bye!